in chapter 12 is inflation. And so we're going to come back to this in chapter 14. Inflation in macroeconomics, as opposed to price changes in microeconomics, are about the overall price level. And so, as we'll see, what we do is we take a weighted average of all the prices in the economy and then see how they've changed over the course of a month or a year. So what we can see here is we have a graph of GDP up here on the top right in blue, unemployment in purple down here, and inflation in yellow in the bottom left. Now, one thing that we tend to see is that price levels tend to increase more slowly during recessions. They may even shrink. And then they tend to increase faster during expansions. But there's a lot of other things that influence the price level. And so we'll see that you can have high inflation even when the economy is not growing very strongly. And we can also have low inflation even when the economy is growing strongly. So if we look at inflation over here, we can see that we had some pretty big spikes of the price level around World War I. That's not too surprising. Often what we see is that prices tend to increase pretty quickly during war because there's such a high demand for goods and other sort of material. Then it fell, back down during after World War I, and it was low during the Great Depression. Now, one thing to note is that it hasn't really been negative very often, if at all, since the end of the Great Depression. And it sort of bounced around. The 1970s were a particularly time of high inflation, both in the UK and in the United States. The United States hit a high of inflation in 1979-1980 of around 13-14%. Before it started coming back down. Inflation has been quite low in the developed world since the financial crisis and the Great Recession. And so we'll talk about that more in chapter 14. So if we want to think about how we measure inflation, we have to think about how we're going to measure prices. So if we're measuring prices, we need some sort of index, right? And so there's a number of different indices. We'll talk about two of the most common. The first is the Consumer Price Index, and this is the index that you'll hear on the news. And it's basically a weighted measure of all the prices that a consumer would buy. So it's not going to include things like gold, it's not going to include things like wheat, it's not going to include things like steel, but it will include housing, it will include food, it will include clothes, it will include education, it will include entertainment, all of those things, a weighted average, and we compare that to some year that we pick, right? So it could be, for instance, 2009. And then we can measure inflation just based on the percent growth in the Consumer Price Index. And that's the number that is often reported in the news, on TV, and on the radio every month. And so in the United States, the Bureau of Labor Statistics measures the Consumer Price Index every month and reports on inflation. It tends to go up and down a fair amount, and there are certain goods, things like food and energy, that tend to go up and down quite a bit. So sometimes they'll report both the total change in CPI and then what's often referred to as the change in core CPI, which often strips out the more volatile prices like food and energy. Another price index is the GDP Deflator. And the GDP Deflator is just the ratio between nominal GDP and real GDP. Now remember from our earlier chapters, nominal GDP is measured in the current year prices. So if we're talking about 2014, nominal GDP is measured in 2014 prices. As opposed to real GDP, which is going to be measured in some base year prices. So if, for example, our base year is 2009, which it often is these days, 2014 real GDP will include quantities from 2014, how much we produced in 2014, but we'll use 2009 prices. And so then we can take a ratio of the two, nominal GDP to real GDP, and create another index, right? And so it will be equal to 1, or usually we call it equal to 100 in the base year. But then the percent change from year to year will give us another measure of inflation, right? It's not just based on consumer prices, because GDP includes consumer spending, investment spending, government spending. And so That's another way to measure inflation. You'll hear the consumer price index a little more often, but the GDP deflator is another measure. You'll often hear things like the producer price index or the employment cost index. These are all just different prices, different ways to measure changes in prices.